Hi, everybody. This is Rachel Cassady with the State Division of Drinking Water, and I am presenting to you today on our source groupings for our public water systems. I'm going to go through this presentation. It's about 25 to 30 minutes long, and then if you have any questions after you watch this video, please don't hesitate to contact me. So let's talk about how to contact me right off the bat. I'm Rachel, and my email address is up here in the corner. Here we go. It's rcassady, Cassady at utah.gov. And my phone number, my direct line to my work phone is 801-536-4467. The best way to get a hold of me is through email. Monday through Thursday are the days that I'm physically in the office, and you hopefully should be able to get a hold of me at the 536-4467 number Monday through Thursday. So that's me and how to contact me if you have any questions after we go through this presentation. What I'm going to do is first go over the history of our source groupings, and then I'm going to talk about the two different kinds that we have, how we're implementing our new policy, and then finally what this will mean for your water system, if anything at all. It's possible that it might not even apply to your system. So, the history of source groupings. Source groupings started clear back in 1993, and just as a little refresher so that we can all transport ourselves back to 1993, these are some of the interesting things that were going on. My favorite is that gas was so cheap, and I can't really remember anything else from those days. But back in 1993 is when all of this started, and what it was the Phase 2, Phase 5 sampling started on January 1st, 1993 for all public water systems. So the question that you have for me is obviously, what in the world is a Phase 2, Phase 5 sample? And what that is it's just fancy lingo for this entire group of samples right here. So your inorganics and metals, your VOCs, which are like gasoline byproducts like xylene, benzene, pesticides, your radionuclides, nitrate and nitrite, and your sodium sulfate TDS. All of these are your Phase 2, Phase 5 samples, and they are all required to be taken at the source in the rule or at the entry point to the distribution system. So these are your Phase 2, Phase 5 samples, and what we did starting in 1993 clear up until 2010 is we would allow water systems to tell us if their sources were mixing before serving any customers. And then if this was the case, this first bullet here, then we would make all of these Phase 2, Phase 5 samples. Instead of being required at each individual source, we said, okay, you can just take them at the entry point to the distribution system, because in the rule it says that you can do that. And then we set up a way to group those samples so that you're only taking one nitrate sample for all of the sources that are mixing, or one VOC sample, and so on and so forth. The other way that we were grouping sources was by determining if the sources were in the same aquifer. And how we did that is the Division of Drinking Water. That's what my DDW stands for here. We checked your inorganic and metals data to decide if the sources were in the same aquifer. If the inorganics and metals data was the same for each of the sources that the water system wanted to be grouped, then we would group them and only apply the Phase 2, Phase 5 monitoring requirement to that group, and then you would just rotate it amongst those sources. So this was the old policy. First, we just relied on the system to tell us if the sources were mixing, and second, we would check the data to determine if it was a common aquifer situation. And we did that for quite a while. We did that from 1993 until 2010. So in 2010, we created a new policy for the source groupings. And your burning question for me is why? And the reason why is we needed to confirm that all the phase 2, phase 5 samples are indeed representative of the water that the consumers are drinking. We were noticing that sometimes the sources that were in the grouping, maybe they were not being used for long periods of time, or perhaps looking at the data more closely, we couldn't really assure ourselves that the sources were pulling from the same aquifer. So we just wanted to put more of the liability basically on the water system to prove to us that this is indeed the case, that you can either group the samples based on common aquifer or entry point. So I'm going to go over these two different scenarios and how the new policy applies to each of them. The first one we're going to do is common aquifer. So common aquifer means that you are pulling, you've got more than one well, and those wells are pulling from the same aquifer. And if that is the case, then we would group those wells for the sampling compliance for the phase 2, phase 5 samples. So if you look at my cute little cartoon here, what you want to imagine is that there's another well that's pulling from this confined aquifer. So there's two wells right here, this artesian well and this imaginary well that you're picturing in your brain for me. And these two wells, they're pulling from the same aquifer, they're screened at the same depth, and when you look at the data, it's pretty much the same water that they're pulling. So if this is the case, then we can say, okay, if you take one nitrate from this well, it's going to count for this artesian well plus my imaginary well right here. So not only is that saving the water system some money on only paying for and taking one sample, but it satisfies our requirements that the nitrate sample is taken to test this water right here. So that is common aquifer. So with the old policy, we would just compare this inorganics and metals data to determine if they were pulling from the same aquifer. This is an example of an inorganic and metals analysis. So you can see what we were looking at. We were looking at cyanide, fluoride, nitrate, clear down all the way through thallium. And if these numbers were, these are the results right here in this column. If these numbers were about the same, then we could say that it was pulling from the same aquifer. And typically, if the water is pulling from the same aquifer, these numbers will be almost exact, just barely off by a little bit. But now we have a new policy, and what the new policy entails are some items that we need the water system manager to provide to us, as well as some information from a professional geologist or a professional engineer. So here's this new policy. The new policy applies to public water systems that have sources in a common aquifer, that you want the sources to be grouped for sampling compliance. You need to make an application. You have to apply to keep or get approved your common aquifer status. So the application for the common aquifer status, you want to remember, is 8 things. You need 8 things to make up a complete application. And here are the 8 things. You want the first 5 here are going to be provided by your professional geologist or engineer who is helping to prepare the report. The first thing is that we need the detailed well logs from the wells that are that you want to be part of this group. The second thing is we need a cross-section prepared from the well logs. Oh, whoops, I'm going to have to change that spelling. That should be the, not h-t. Sorry about that. But a cross-section prepared from the well logs that indicates that the wells are drawing water from the same aquifer. And then a review of the chemical data, and this can include any chemical data that you have, not just the inorganics and metals, but we definitely need the inorganics and metals as part of this item number 3. The fourth thing is that we'll need a statement that's signed by the professional, that it is in that person's opinion that all the wells are in the common aquifer. And then the last thing that this professional needs to do is stamp the report. So those are the first 5 things that we're going to need from your professional engineer or geologist. And then the last three things are things that we need from the water system manager. The first one is this number 6 right here, and that is a signed and dated statement from the water system that the sampling will not threaten public health. So it's not going to hurt anybody to sample from one of the wells and not all of the others in the same sampling period. The second thing is we need a plan for the sampling that's going to take place for all the sources that shows that the samples are going to be rotated through each active source. So what this means is that if you have 10 wells that you're getting grouped based on common aquifer status, and you make this application and you get it approved, and then we say, okay, you only have to take your VOCs, your RADs, your inorganic metals, nitrate, pesticides, all of that. You only have to take it once from one of the wells. What we want you to do as part of this sampling plan is we want you to rotate those samples throughout those different wells. So you can't be sampling your nitrate every year from well number 3. You have to move it. You have to take it from well number 3 one year, well number 4 the next year, well number 7 the year after that. You just have to keep rotating those samples. You can't just pick one of the sources in this common aquifer group and only sample from that one for the rest of time. So the last one, the number 8 of our 8 items that we need, is we need just copies of data of the background chem samples for each individual source. So those are your items that you need to put together, and you submit those to the Division of Drinking Water, and then our Administrative Services section at the Division of Drinking Water is going to review the Common Aquifer submittal and then decide if the sources qualify for the Common Aquifer status. You'll get a letter in response to us, an approval letter, or a disapproval letter, a denial letter, either way, but you should hear back from us within a short time frame. If you have already done this, you've already done this application and you're just waiting to hear back, feel free to contact me and I'll get back with you and let you know where in process your application is. We shouldn't be too behind on these currently. So that is your common aquifer status. That's how to get it. If you already have a common aquifer setup and you have not done this application for the new policy, you're going to need to put together this application if you want to keep the source groupings that you have based on a common aquifer. So that's common aquifer. Hopefully that made sense. If it didn't, please contact me and I will do a better job, hopefully, of explaining it to you. So the second way to group your sources is the entry point. Entry point is when the sources mix before entering the distribution system. And there has to be a place where you can actually take the samples before serving any customers. You cannot take the phase 2, phase 5 samples at the first customer. It has to be at a location before any customers are served. That's key for entry point. So I'm going to explain this a little bit more in detail with my really awesome schematic here that I did all by myself, which I'm sure you can tell. But anyway, I think it kind of hopefully explains the whole idea here. The idea being that you've got these 3 sources, springs 1, 2, and 3. Let's say they're up a mountainside, which is usually the case sometimes in the state of Utah. And they all flow down the mountain into a storage tank. And there's a sampling tap right here by my arrow where the water system manager can sample the combined combination of these 3 sources before serving any of the homes or any of the connections in the distribution system. So the key to making this work is that all of these sources are mostly used year-round, and when the samples are taken at this sampling location, all of them are active and providing water to the distribution system. If one of these springs serves a customer, if there's a home right here, or even a drinking water fountain off of the line that takes spring 1 down into this storage tank, then this entry point wouldn't work for these springs. They have to be completely mixed and sampled after mixing, but before serving any customers. So that's entry point. That's how the setup should be anyway. So this is just a little bit more detail on the entry point and what it is, what it means. The water systems can only sample when all the sources that are combining are in use, so they all need to be active at the time that the samples are taken. And in order to make sure that this is taking place, we want the water system to submit to the Division of Drinking Water. Now, this is the new part, the new policy. Submit to the Division of Drinking Water a sampling plan. And what this sampling plan is that it's a plan where you certify to us that the sources that are in the group source sampling station, that they're all operational at the time that you're sampling, and it shows your planned dates of future sampling. And I'm going to show you an example of what this sampling plan looks like. So you need to provide us with this sampling plan so that we know that the phase 2, phase 5 samples are indeed representative of the sources that are combining before entering the system. So you get us this sampling plan, but then the second thing is that you also submit copies of your past phase 2, phase 5 samples for each source in the entry point grouping. So for my schematic that we just looked at, you would submit all of your phase 2, phase 5 samples for springs 1, 2, and 3 if we did not already have them. So what that includes is just your new source inorganics and metals, your VOCs or your volatile organics, pesticides, RADs, and nitrate that have been taken directly at each source in the potential grouping. One thing to keep in mind is that when a new source comes online and receives its operating permit from the Division of Drinking Water, all of these samples will have been taken at the source initially. So every source, every public water system source that's been approved by the Division of Drinking Water has had these samples, or should have had these samples taken before the approval letter goes out that it can be used as part of the drinking water system. So you include the data. So let's look at the sampling plan really quick. This sampling plan example, I'll show you where you can find it online. It's on our website. But what you do is you give us the group source sampling station ID number. We use numbers to track all of our sources and group source sampling stations. And the group source sampling stations, they'll always start with an SS and then have a 3-digit number after them. You can put in a new number if you want a new number for an existing group source sampling station that you prefer over the one that's arbitrarily been assigned, or you can just use the one that's already been assigned. So you put the sampling station number here, and then in the next columns you list off the source facility ID numbers that those sources have. Alongside of that would be the name of the source, and then the operational period for each of those sources. So you'll show us that they're all being used mostly, or if not year-round. You'll just be upfront and say, this new well right here is only used for a couple months in the summertime. But then what you'll do over here, and this is key, is that you'll show us your planned dates for the phase 2, phase 5 sampling. So you'll notice that this date here is a date that is representative of when all of these sources are active. So you put together this sampling plan and you send it to the rules section, which is, I'm going to go back one and talk about how you submit that. You submit that to my section, which is the rules section. We review the entry point sampling plan and then decide if he qualifies for the entry point sampling. And you get an approval letter or a disapproval letter, and you continue on your merry way. So those are the two different types, the common aquifer and the entry point and the new policy. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we are implementing this new policy. All systems that have group source sampling stations should have received a notice of this policy in July of 2010. We sent out a letter to all of our systems that already had these group source sampling stations and told them about this new policy. And then we gave all of our systems this time frame. And the time frame is when water systems have to either submit their common aquifer application or their sampling plan for the entry point to the Division of Drinking Water in order to maintain their group source sampling stations. So this is something that you really want to pay attention to if your system falls into this. And so you just check your system population and then check the deadline for the application. So right now we're just at the beginning of 2013. So most water systems with any system serving populations of 500 or more have had to have will have to have submitted their group source sampling applications by the end of this year. For systems serving 3,300 and above, the deadline has already passed, and those systems, if they have not submitted the application and received an approval letter, they will lose their group source sampling stations. So if you miss your deadline, you don't submit your application, what happens? Well, we take away the source group sampling station. Sorry, that's hard to say over and over again. Anyway, you lose your groupings, and what that means is that you have to take your nitrate, your inorganic metals, your VOCs, your pesticides, your RADs at each individual source location. So it just multiplies the time, work, and money that you have to put into this chemical sampling, which is not good. So what does this mean for you? Well, first of all, you have to decide, you have to figure out if you have a group source sampling station. If you don't have a group source sampling station, then I hope you've had a really good nap during my presentation. If you do have a group source sampling station, or you don't have one but you want one, then I hope you've been paying very close attention, because this is really important. So how do you find out if you have a group source sampling station? Well, you have to look at your monitoring schedule, and that report you can get on our online reports on our website. But you get a hold of your monitoring schedule and you check to see for the sampling if you have anything labeled group source sampling station. And you'll also look for the facility ID code. So you're going to want to find something that has an SS and then the 3-digit code, and then it'll say group source sampling station. If you have this anywhere on your monitoring schedule, then you already have a group source sampling station, and you need to confirm if you can keep it, first of all, based on the entry point status. And why do I say the entry point status instead of common aquifer? Well, it's because entry point status is a lot easier to get an approval letter for. All you have to do is fill out the sampling plan. You have to have a place where the sources are mixing and a place where you can take the sample before any customers are served. That's a lot easier if, of course, if your system is set up that way, it's a lot easier to get this entry point approval, because the common aquifer approval, you have to hire a professional geologist or engineer and put together that whole application. So I guess it just depends on how your system is set up. But if your sources are most always active, they mix before serving any customers, and then they can be sampled at a mixing point. If the answer is yes, then you want to apply for the entry point sampling. If your sources do not mix before entering the distribution system, but they are wells that can be considered, or you believe that they are part of a common aquifer, then you want to apply for the common aquifer status. So this is key. If they're mixing and can be sampled at a mixing point, apply for the entry point status by the deadline. But if not, you do think that they can be considered to be in a common aquifer, then put together the application for the common aquifer status and get that one. One of the two, either one, whichever works. If neither of these can apply to your system, the entry point or the common aquifer status can't apply to your system, then, and you already do have a group source sampling station, then what's going to happen is the group source sampling station will be removed, and the phase 2, phase 5 samples will need to be done at each of the individual sources. Sad, I know, and a lot more money and time, but the whole point of taking the phase 2, phase 5 samples is to provide to you and to us as your regulator the chemical water quality that's feeding your customers is safe at the source. So that is the source grouping update and the history behind it, the two different types of ways that we group sources, how we're implementing our new policy, and what it means to you. So if you do have any questions or you're confused at all by my presentation, I definitely want you to contact me over email or just give me a call, and I can go over this with you in more detail and according to the needs of your system. So now I want to go over how to get a copy of that the new policy as well as the sampling plan. So you want to go to our website, which is drinkingwater.utah.gov, and over here on the left hand side you want to click on programs. So hopefully you can see my giant mouse. I made my cursor gigantic. Hopefully you can see my super duper huge arrow here, but you want to click on programs, and then you want the last link here, you want source protection. So click on source protection, and the second paragraph down is this entry point common aquifer policy, and it has some links in here that will help you out. So the first link is the sampling plan. So we'll click on that really quick, and it takes you through a blank sampling plan. You can actually just print this out and fill this in and fax it back to me, sign your name and date it, and I will accept that as the sampling plan for your water system. Or you can recreate this in a document of your own. But this is just to give you an idea of what I'm looking for, and then down here is just the example that you saw in the presentation. So that's the sampling plan. That's this first link. And then the second link that we have in here is the actual entry point and common aquifer policy paper. So you can click on this and you can read through the policy that we wrote. It's just 2 pages, so you hopefully won't pull your hair out by the time you're done reading it. But it goes over the details of the entry point grouping requirements, the common aquifer grouping requirements, and those specific 8 items that we're going to need from you for that application, our implementation, and then any questions that you may have about waivers or new sources, or what do I do if something's detected at my over the MCL or near the MCL from my group source sampling, phase 2, phase 5 sampling that I'm doing. These little paragraphs should answer your questions on that. If they don't, of course, please give me a call. And so just to recap, this is from, you go to programs, drinkingwater.utah.gov, click on programs, source protection, and here's the policy right here, entry point common aquifer policy. And then me, I will show you me. You don't get any visuals, but I'll show you where I'm at on the org chart so you can see where I fall in case you need to find me. Let me see if I can zoom in on this. There we go. Okay, so I work for Patty Favre. She's our manager of the rules section, and this is me right here, Rachel Cassady. So I'm in the rules section. When you submit your common aquifer policy, or application, sorry, you can submit a policy, but I don't know that we're going to do anything with it. But when you submit your application for common aquifer status, it's going to go to Brad Holdaway. He's in the rules section with me. If you submit the sampling plan for your entry point grouping, it's going to go to me. So either Brad or myself can help you out with those. And then in our administrative services section, Jim Martin is helping us also with the common aquifer application approvals. So these are the 3 main people, Jim Martin, Brad Holdaway, and myself, that you want to contact if you have questions about any of the information that I've talked about today. So that is my presentation, and I hope you have a great rest of the day, and please contact me again if you have any questions.